Hello everyone, I'm going to talk about The Running Man. So, one specific aspect of The Running Man I think is really fascinating, and that's the adaptations and the specific issue with the first one. So, I just read this again, so I read it years and years back, I'd forgotten a lot of it, but I really liked it, I thought it was brilliant. And there's obviously a new adaptation that's just coming out now that's been directed by Edgar Wright, and just looking at the character list on the IMDb, I could see that it's closer to the book than the 80s version directed by Paul Michael Glaser. And the Paul Michael Glaser one is so removed from this book, it's quite crazy really that it's an adaptation. But that's where the story gets really interesting. It isn't really a strict adaptation of The Running Man. It's called The Running Man, and it's credited as an adaptation of the Stephen King story, The Running Man. But the Paul Michael Glaser film from the 80s had to go through a lawsuit that relates to Robert Sheckley. Where's the book? So Robert Sheckley, one of my favourite writers. If you know my channel, you know he's one of my favourite writers. He wrote a story that was developed into a couple of novels, and also was adapted into a French film as well. And that story was Seventh Victim, and that came out in 1954. And I think he got that germ of an idea in The Seventh Victim and then developed into another story, which is when The Running Man starts connecting. But The Seventh Victim is a story where the government is controlling population by holding these games where people can volunteer to be a part of this kind of public killing spree thing. It's a short story. He developed into a novel in 65 with a novel called The 10th Victim. And then in 87, there was Victim Prime. And in 88, there was the last one, which was just called Hunter Victim. So he kind of developed those ideas that was springing off The Seventh Victim. But in 1958, he wrote a story called The Prize of Peril. Robert Sheckley wrote a story called The Prize of Peril. And this was pretty much like this plot and kind of beats of the 80s version of The Running Man. And a French director called Yves Boisset, he adapted The Prize of Peril in a French film in 1983. And that was called Le Prix de Danger, which you can translate pretty literally as The Prize of Peril. And it was an adaptation of the story. And as I say, very close to the 80s version of The Running Man. And when the Paul Michael Glaser version of The Running Man came out a little while after that, Yves Boisset took the Paul Michael Glaser version of The Running Man to court, suing them for plagiarism. And he won the case. So he successfully sued them for stealing the ideas from the film. And the reason why it was the film rather than the story was there was specific lines from the film, and there were like details that were in the film, and like some of the look of the film and things like that, that were directly copied by the Paul Michael Glaser version of The Running Man. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought, well, I wonder what Robert Sheckley thought about all that. And I kind of did some investigating, and it turns out that he thought that The Running Man by Stephen King was quite close to The Prize of Peril, and he wondered if Stephen King had read it. But he also knew that Stephen King is on record as being a fan of Robert Sheckley. So he contacted Stephen King, because they'd met and all that sort of stuff, and had a chat with him. And Stephen King said he couldn't remember reading the story and just sort of claimed it was all accidental. And Robert Sheckley believed it. So much like many cases of music plagiarism, proving that you nicked it or you just weren't aware that you'd already read it and you just had it in your brain, you know, sometimes these things are difficult to prove. But Robert Sheckley took Stephen King's word for it that he hadn't read a story, and may have inadvertently taken those ideas from The Prize of Peril into The Running Man. But what is interesting as a fan of Robert Sheckley is nobody ever talks about The Prize of Peril by Robert Sheckley, which is a great short story that is like a really like not 1958. It's a very early version of that sort of public gladiator thing that we see all the time now. So there we are. Robert Sheckley's link to The Running Man.